It's been quite a while since I've done a video, right? Not a problem. I'm gonna just go through the events of the past week and kind of background where I think the way ahead is, right? I'm not gonna go into the tactical details of Wagner withdrawing from Bakhmut and crossing into Russia and then their march up towards Moscow. Um, Not really gonna go into that, but I'm gonna talk about the background of how this came to be a little bit. Um, and then kind of where I think it's headed in the future. So hopefully this answers some questions, and people want to hear me talk for some ungodly reason, which I'm kind of a clown, so I don't know why, but here I'll ramble on for about now until I'm done. Right. Um, this is one of my favorite pictures in the world. I love this picture, right? Because here you have 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, that young boy there, and then right behind that young boy is, of course, Vladimir Putin when he was an officer in the KGB, right? And that's in Red Square in Moscow, right? So I love that picture. It just shows, those intricacies of the Cold War. All right, come on now. It's supposed to go to my next slide. But this thing is just going to be a pain in my ass, isn't it? There we go. I might end up moving myself around here just to so I can show these wonderful pictures. All right, and wonderful slides I made. I want to talking about Putin himself, right? And who was Putin? Who is he? Where did this guy come from? Putin was a KGB officer in East Germany, in Dresden specifically, during the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what Putin did is he was the liaison, he was a mentor to the Stasi, which was the state secret service of East Germany. And if you've studied any of the former communist states in Central and Eastern Europe during the Cold War, you would know that East Germany was brutal. It was incredibly repressive, and it was the Stasi. And so at the fall of the Berlin Wall, East Germans immediately rushed into like every Stasi building in East Germany to safeguard the files, right? And so they could turn that as evidence against the Stasi. And then what a lot of people found, a lot of East Germans found, is that husbands were reporting on their wives, wives reporting on their husbands, parents reporting on their children, children reporting on their parents, right? It was just an awful, awful repressive environment where everyone was an agent of the Stasi. Um, Destroyed families, destroyed the fabrics of society in East Germany. Um, and Putin was front and center of that regime. So that's where he was in 1989 when the wall fell. He was in Dresden, East Germany, as a liaison to the Stasi, right? And and he loved it. He stated he loved that assignment. That was his favorite, right? So he was a KGB lieutenant colonel there at the end. He resigned from the KGB in '91. That's when the USSR was dissolving, all right? And as that happened, a lot of the Soviet state-owned, not a lot of it, all the Soviet state-owned industry was sold off to a few wealthy businessmen in Russia, and those are what become what you know today as the Russian oligarchs, right? So all of that, the banking, the manufacturing, the mining, that all goes to them. right? They are the ones who purchase it from the now Russian Federation. At that same time, a guy named Boris Yeltsin becomes president of the Russian Federation. Yeltsin to Russians is a joke. And if you remember back in the early 90s, even, from a Western perspective, from an American perspective, Yeltsin we looked at him as a drunk, right? And the Russians looked at him the same way, right? They looked at him as a drunk, as an idiot, as a clown, as an embarrassment to the Russian people. And the real power resided in the oligarchs, those who had the financial means, who now controlled, 99% of the Russian economy, right? So in comes Putin, right? He immediately begins his political career upon leading the KGB in St. Petersburg, right? He's the deputy mayor. He becomes a favorite among the oligarchs because he enables their money laundering schemes. He gives them government loans, which is really just handing them government money, right? It's not a loan; it's a grant, right? He controls licenses. He controls gambling license, business license. He controls those and he issues them, right? And so that's an exchange of power between Putin and the oligarchs. Later, March 97, a few years later, becomes deputy chief of Presidential Property Management Department. And this is the movement of foreign-based Soviet property to the Russian Federation, which ends up in the hands of oligarchs in a lot of cases, right? So he's always has, one fist in the pot of gold, right? And has no problem moving the pot of gold to his oligarchs, all right? And that's an exchange of power between oligarchs and Putin. And this continues to grow throughout the 90s. 98, for a short period, he's the director of the FSS, which is the modern KGB, right? It's KGB by a new name, right? It comes to a point, 1999, Putin becomes prime minister. There were 3 prime ministers, but he was the first of the prime ministers, right? And how is Putin getting here? Well, the oligarchs, right? They enable this move, all right, because it serves their interest, vis-a-vis the European Union, expanding NATO, and they know Putin is a real Russian, right? Not like Yeltsin. Putin's a real Russian, cares about Russian interests, and he's going to protect Russian interests domestically and internationally, right? Which is what the oligarchs want because money and power is the name of their game. Later, 1999, last day of the year, Boris Yeltsin resigns. Putin is acting president. So in just 1 year's time, he goes from a ministerial level position to president. All right. And in May, the election was in March, but in May of 2000, he assumes office as president of Russia for his first term. Does 2 terms as president. All right. Per the Russian Constitution, he's out after 2 terms. He just a guy named Dmitry Medvedev, we'll talk about a little bit later, becomes president, and Putin immediately becomes the prime minister, right? And Medvedev is just, I call him, he's the dollar store Putin, right? So Putin's still in control as his prime minister. Comes up time for the 2012 presidential elections. Of course, Medvedev recommends to party leadership that they nominate Vladimir Putin as their nominee for president. And of course, March 12, he wins. In May of 2012, he begins his 3rd presidential term. This term now is a 6-year term, right? They were 4-year terms. Magically, the Russian Constitution was changed. Now he serves 6-year terms. And so this 3rd term in 2012, his 4th term started in 2018. Okay, and then the next presidential election, Russia is coming up next year in 2024. Right, March 24 is the next presidential election cycle in Russia. Right, and magically, Guess who's eligible to run for president again? All right, so we'll get into the Wagner Group coup d'etat here in a minute. All right, Prigozhin. Who is Prigozhin? All right, he's a St. Petersburg native. All right, that's him right there in the middle. Good-looking fellow there. All right, you see him? Got body armor, got his K-pod on. He's on the front lines with the boys. All right, showing his presence. He started as, as a, just a thug, um, like a numbers runner, right back in the day in the American mafia. But guys started gambling businesses in St. Petersburg, right? Enabled by Putin, right? Because Putin enabled gambling, gave gambling licenses out. All right, so that's how Prigozhin got his start, right? In the seedy underworld of Russia, right? And those businesses enabled by Putin as the deputy mayor. He also has success there. Starts coming up in the world. Bam, he's becomes a restaurateur, right? Who's he get his license from to start his restaurants? Putin, right? So those connections, to the criminal underworld, the gambling connections, the finances that came from that, the revenue from that, enables him to start his little restaurant empire, all right? So throughout the 90s and in the early 2000s, he's building more power, and he's connected to Putin, right, from Putin's time as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, right? So Prigozhin's getting government contracts for catering other food services like schools, right? So Russian schools, Moscow schools, their food is not Aramark, it's Prigozhin, right? that's their food vendor. So as it comes around, we start getting into the 2010s. He has enough so much money at this point from his political connections and the contracts and the businesses he's been able to lead. He starts this thing called Wagner Group, all right? And Wagner Group is a paramilitary, mercenary type of organization. So starts up in May 2014. So we see Wagner Group initially really in Africa and Syria, in Ukraine, right, in 2014, and a little bit in Latin America, right? So that's kind of how he comes to power. He starts the bottom and works his way up and becomes connected to Putin in St. Petersburg. So how do we come to the coup d'etat? So after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Wagner Group becomes a part of it, right? The mercenary army becomes a part of it. And I think what's really driving Prigozhin here is the underwhelming performance of the Russian military, right? The Russian military, right, as we well know, got it handed to them pretty well. They're low paid, they're conscript, they're poorly trained, they're poorly equipped, they're ill led, right? Just not a good army, is what it turns out to be. On the flip side, Wagner Group is better paid, better trained, better equipped. They're fighting for something like personal freedom, because they're inmates, they're bad guys, right? That's why they're part of Wagner Group. That's why he hired them. So there's some kind of guarantee for them on the flip side of their service in Ukraine. Prigozhin does not think highly of Minister of Defense Shoigu or Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov. Interesting, Shoigu is half Tuvan, which is a Turkic Mongol ethnic group, and half Russian, but his hometown's near the Mongolian border. Shoigu came up under the Yeltsin regime. He was an engineer, was in the construction business, as was Yeltsin before Yeltsin became president, so there's a connection there. And Yeltsin enabled Shoigu to enter into politics in the political sphere. All right, so Shoigu did serve 20 plus years as Minister of Emergency Situations, which is like an internal self-defense, like a national army, national police, type of role, like a gendarme kind of role. Um, but throughout that time in that position, he became to be trusted by Putin, right? So that's how in 2012 he becomes Minister of Defense. So Shoigu doesn't really have a military and army background, but he does have that gendarme kind of command background. And in that role, as the Minister of Emergency Situations, he was promoted to a rank equivalent to, 4-star general in the Russian military. Gerasimov, on the other hand, chief of the general staff since 2012, same year Shoigu was elevated to Minister of Defense. Gerasimov is a career Army officer, right? So he has served, he graduated military academy like 1973, 74. Armor officer by trade, right? So he's a tanker, he's like me. Not as good as me, not as good looking, and not as good of a tanker, but he's a career officer. But boy, Prigozhin does not like either one of them. He finds them incompetent and doesn't trust their decision-making capabilities, especially their lack of support to Wagner, right? And over the past 6 months, really, you've heard Prigozhin complain about lack of ammo, lack of food, other supplies coming to Wagner forces that were promised by the Ministry of Defense, right? And they never came. Or if they came in limited supplies. They came late, too late to affect the battle, right? So he's not a big fan. Also, the poor performance of regular army and the better performance of Wagner in Ukraine. Prigozhin wants Wagner weighed like a main effort. He views himself as the main effort of the Russian campaign in Ukraine, and he really was. But the MOD and the Army did not supply him like he was the main effort. Right? So lack of significant progress in the Donbas, failures in other parts of Ukraine, festered a lot of discontent, right? Which leads to this coup d'etat kind of attempt, all right? All right. So why does a coup fail? Really, this and what specifically why do I think this coup failed? I think it lacks support. Um, you either have to have overwhelming popular support, or you have to have overwhelming military force. And I don't think he had either. He had localized support. He didn't have universal support all the way up into Moscow, right? Which is why he didn't make it all the way. He did not see scores of Russian people and military forces, police, other security services flip to Wagner's side. Could that have something to do with Shoigu's really at this point 30 plus years experience? Good. There might be some loyalty to Shoigu in there. There might be loyalty to Gerasimov, or they just don't trust, right? Prigozhin, right? So, but regardless, there wasn't enough support, popular support, to enable a coup, and Wagner didn't really have the overwhelming force necessary to overthrow a government and right, the and is big, and maintain control, right? So any counterattack, counteroffensive by the Russian military would have likely dislodged Wagner from their position of power, right? And the last thing I think it made it fail is supplies, right? Which goes along with support. Wagner's not getting supplied in Ukraine, where they're actively part of the Russian special military operation, right? If they're not getting supported conducting combat operations in Ukraine, they're not properly supported to conduct a coup inside of Russia, right? So I think between those two, that's why the coup failed, and we ended up with some kind of negotiated truce between Putin and Prigozhin, right? So what's his position for negotiation with Putin? How do I think that went? I don't think Lukashenko played as big a role in it as Lukashenko's trying to make you believe. But bottom line, Prigozhin completely turned on the man who made him, right? Because Putin made him. Putin made him an oligarch, right? He wasn't rich, right? When the Soviet Union fell, he kind of worked his way up, became a made man, right, and rose to the level of an oligarch, right? And Putin enabled that, right? So he's Putin's man, right? He turned on Putin. So I can imagine the disappointment and Vlad has of his boy, right? He abandoned his positions in the Donbas, opening opportunities for Ukraine's offensive, which may or may not be going. All right, but that weakens Prigozhin's position in any negotiation with Putin. Right, turned on him. He abandoned his post, which is allowing the enemy a tactical advantage. Right. Because of these years of dedicated service, I think that's why Putin allows him to live in exile. Right. So Prigozhin has to go to Belarus. Right. He has to go to Minsk. That's where he has to go. Right. And then the mix of Wagner forces, if they participated, they have to go to Ukraine. If they don't participate, they can join the Russian army and go fight for the fatherland. Right. Whatever the details are of that crap. We'll see. I think a lot of people are going to disappear. Likewise, how long is Prigozhin going to live once he hits ground in Minsk and gets set up in this nice little apartment? How long until he meets some kind of untimely demise? He's not a young man anyway, so we'll see how it ends up for him. I've imagined he's gonna have a meeting, with the Reaper soon. Here's the big thing, right? What do I think are the lingering effects of this failed coup? The Putin regime is damaged domestically, right? This is not something that Putin and the regime were able to keep secret from Russian people. It was in the Russian media. They acknowledged it. They talked about it. Putin himself has talked about it. People know this happened. And people know that it actually came pretty close to having some degree of success, right? Whether it was going to be a complete success and overthrow the Putin government, or it was going to significantly damage it, right? They were 2 hours from Moscow, right? And people know that, so what is the real level of damage and how long is that effect going to last? I don't know, right? That's a good question. Lukashenko as a negotiator, was he really the go-between? I don't really think he was. I think he got roped into it. Like, hey, Prigozhin's going to be your problem. You're going to babysit him, right? Because Lukashenko's a tool of Putin as well. But also, it might strengthen his position, regionally, and that might have been one of Putin's intent. Part of his intent, outcome of this is, hey, I'm gonna boost up my boy Lukashenko now, since Prigozhin's pissed me off. Lukashenko, you're bumped up. What's Wagner Group's future, right? Is Prigozhin allowed to maintain control of Wagner Group in Africa and Latin America? Their ongoing operations, Central African Republic, we know that. We know they're there. So is he allowed to still have some kind of control over that from his new residence in Minsk? I don't know, right? Or does someone else get appointed, right? And then it gets renamed something else. We do know this has degraded Russian military capability and capacity in the Donbas, period, right? Wagner Group was probably the best Russian forces there. Now they're no longer part of the Russian front there, right? So that's going to have an effect on Russia's capability. throughout the rest of the summer in eastern Ukraine. And the last linger effect here is, what is the future of mercenary forces similar to the Wagner Group? Um, how are they controlled by their overseer, so that they're meeting those military and operational objectives, but they're controlled to some point where they're unable to turn on their master, right? Bite the hand that feeds them. Right. So we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. I know over in China they're like, no mercenaries, right? We're not going to use mercenaries, because it came close, right? At least in appearance. And the last question I have here is, who's the future president of the Russian Federation? And what is that going to mean for Russia, right? I don't necessarily have the answer for this now. I'm not seeing it in the future. And I have friends, and there are people out there a lot smarter than I am on political futures forecasting. But talk about candidates. Putin can run in March 2024, because magically the Russian Constitution enables Putin to run for a fifth term in the March 2024 elections. There's only one declared candidate this time. Putin is not declared yet. He's expected to, but he has not yet declared that he's running in the 2024 election. Ivan Otrankovsky, this dude is an ultra nationalist, so like super super right wing. He's called a militant. He's called Holy Rus, right? Militant Russian Orthodox. He's a member of the Defenders of the Fatherland Party, and he's a proponent of holy war, right? So it'd be thought that he would continue the operations in Ukraine should he become president, and declared a holy war. So he has declared he's running. So we'll see his name. I'm certain Putin is going to declare as well. Other potential candidates, we know Medvedev. He's a former president, former prime minister. Like I said, like I call him, he's Putin's dollar store clone. Right? He's a little bit younger. He's late 50s. He would continue the war in Ukraine. He would continue the Russian nationalist mantra, much along the same lines as Putin. Not more, not less. It'd be consistent with Putin. Mikhail Mishustin, he's the current prime minister. Some folks would expect him to declare, especially if Medvedev does not. He'd probably be the guy who would. Again, run along the same vein as Putin. It's kind of devil kind of thing. No more, no less. Consistent along those lines. Continue the war in Ukraine. Continue anti-Western rhetoric and balance of power between Russia and the West. The last couple of guys, this is where it gets spooky, right? Pavel Grudinin, he is a member of the Russian Communist Party, and he idolizes Joseph Stalin. So if he declares that he would win, expect him to push for a Stalinist type regime. Political pogroms along the lines of Stalin, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin in the late 30s, 40s, and early 1950s, right? People disappear, right? Go to Siberia and they're never heard from again. Maxim Sorokin, Communist of Russia Party, not to be confused with the Russian Communist Party, but the Communist of Russia Party. His stated goal is restore the Soviet Union and to restore a Warsaw Pact type alliance to include negotiated alliances with North Korea, Iran, Syria, as part of a larger Soviet alliance, right? So again, probably, Stalin, Brezhnev, kind of premier is what you would expect from him should he declare and win. I think odds are you're going to get a Putin. Putin's going to run again. And if for some reason Putin does not, you're going to get Medvedev or Mishustin. One of the two. I don't think both. I think you're going to get one or the other as the heir of Putin, whoever's his favorite when March of 24 rolls around. So that's kind of how I think that'll lay out. Um, but what does that mean for Russia? Like any of these candidates, these six candidates listed here, is going to continue. So really, three of the six would continue along the same lines of Putin, because one of them is Putin and two of them is his clones. The other three guys are a little bit more hardline Russian nationalists. Like, as hard as it might be to imagine, they're more Russian nationalists than Putin is. So that would be the scary side, right? As if one of those three guys does win the presidency in the Russian Federation in 2024, right? And if there's a winner declared in the March 24 elections, they take office in May of 24. So odds are you're going to get Putin or one of his buddies. But there are three other options there. One of them has already declared he's running for the presidency. That could be a significant increase in the hostility towards the West. So, further isolate Russia from the world, further alienate and drive a wedge and increase hostilities and tensions between Russia and most of the rest of the world. Is the possible outcome of this. So, we'll see. We'll see what holds over really the next 9 months. What is the continued fallout from the coup attempt? Even though Putin's trying to step back and say, well, it wasn't a coup attempt, it was some upset guys, but we got it under control. No, it was a coup attempt, bro. Just not a really good one. So what is the continued fallout of that? Is Putin able to maintain a level where he can win the presidential election? I think yes, if he wants to, or he gets one of these younger guys to go out and do it, and he just stays behind the scenes doing this as the puppet master. All right, so hey, that's my 33-minute ramble here at the evening. Didn't even touch my bourbon the whole time of rambling, so got to get some of this down my gullet. I hope it's useful. Just stuff going through my head, especially as I'm asked by some guys who are actually a lot more intelligent than I am. Right? They're asking me to opine on this, and you know who you are. You're smarter than me. All right, I want to hear from you too. So I'll try to get a little bit more active and do a little bit more of this in the near future. But hope it's useful. Hope you enjoy it, and talk to you guys later.